"Step outside slowly, ma'am," the officer said, his voice flat, practiced, like this was routine, like the 10 patrol cars lining the narrow street were just another Tuesday night. But nothing about the scene felt ordinary as red and blue lights washed over Angela Brooks' small front yard, reflecting off the white siding of her house and the quiet row of mailboxes across the street, turning everything into something colder, something harder, as if the neighborhood itself had been placed under judgment. And inside that glow stood Angela, barefoot on the wooden porch, a thin gray sweatshirt pulled tight around her, her breath visible in the cool night air, her eyes steady despite the weight of every gaze pressed against her, because neighbors had already begun to gather behind curtains and half-open doors, phones raised just enough to record, but not enough to be seen. And somewhere down the block a screen door creaked as a child whispered a question no one answered, while Officer Daniel Hayes stepped forward from the line of uniforms, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable, the kind of face that had decided something long before arriving. And when Angela descended the 2 steps onto the concrete path, her feet meeting the cold surface with a quiet firmness, she didn't rush, didn't argue, didn't ask why there were more officers than the street had ever seen. She simply looked at him and waited. And that waiting unsettled something invisible in the air, because it wasn't fear, it wasn't defiance, it was something quieter, something grounded, like a person who knew exactly where they stood even if no one else did. And Hayes broke that silence with a clipped instruction, asking her to place her hands where he could see them. And she did, slowly, deliberately, her fingers open, her shoulders relaxed, her movements measured like she refused to let the moment define her. And yet the tension tightened anyway, because the flashing lights kept spinning, because the radios crackled with coded fragments no one explained, because the sheer number of officers suggested a story already written without her. And still Angela said nothing, her gaze drifting briefly past Hayes toward the line of cars, toward the shadows of figures moving behind windshields, toward the unseen reason that had brought them all here, and then back again, steady, unshaken, until Hayes stepped closer, close enough that his presence filled the narrow space between them. And in that moment, as the night seemed to hold its breath, Angela spoke for the first time, her voice low, even, almost gentle. "There's been a mistake," she said, not as a plea, not as a protest, but as a fact, and the words hung there, suspended in the flashing light, unanswered, as if the truth itself had just been introduced into a situation that had no intention of hearing it. Angela's words did not echo. They settled, soft but firm, like something that refused to be moved, and for a brief second the flashing lights seemed louder than before, the radios sharper, the presence of 10 patrol cars suddenly heavier, as if the entire street had leaned in to hear what would happen next. But Officer Hayes did not respond right away. He studied her instead, his eyes scanning her face not for fear, but for inconsistency, for something that would confirm the version of events already written in his mind. Yet Angela stood exactly the same, shoulders steady, hands still visible, her breathing slow and controlled. And that calm created a subtle friction in the air, because it did not match the scene they had built around her. It did not match the urgency, the numbers, the assumption, and one of the younger officers shifted his weight nearby, glancing between Hayes and Angela like he expected something to break the tension. But nothing did, not yet. And then Hayes finally spoke, his tone measured, almost rehearsed, explaining that they were following a report, that her name had come up connected to something serious, something that required immediate action, though he did not say exactly what, and the lack of detail hung heavier than any accusation, because it left no space for her to respond, no clear shape to defend against, only a shadow cast in front of her door. And Angela listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving his, as if she was weighing not just his words but the space between them, the certainty behind them. And when he finished, she gave a small nod, not agreement, not submission, just acknowledgement, and that single motion seemed to unsettle him more than resistance would have, because it suggested she understood more than he expected. And behind them a neighbor's phone tilted slightly to get a better angle, capturing the stillness, the imbalance, the quiet dignity that refused to crack. And somewhere a car engine idled, low and constant, like a reminder that time was still moving even if this moment felt suspended. and Angela finally spoke again, her voice just as calm as before, asking what exactly they believed she had done, not with anger, not with fear, but with clarity, and Hayes hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before answering in broader terms, repeating that it was an ongoing situation, that they needed her cooperation, that this was for everyone's safety, phrases that filled space without revealing truth, and Angela's gaze softened slightly, not in weakness but in recognition, as if she had heard this kind of language before, somewhere else, in another life, under different circumstances, and the realization passed through her quietly, settling into something deeper than the moment itself. Because this was not just about what was happening on her front lawn, this was about what they believed. They were looking at when they saw her standing there, and as the lights continued to pulse across her face, she exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air, and said, almost to herself but loud enough to be heard, "You are looking at the wrong story." And the words did not challenge them. They revealed something they had not yet considered, and for the first time since the cars arrived, the certainty in the scene began to thin, just slightly, just enough for doubt to find its way in. The words lingered longer than anyone expected, not loud, not forceful, but impossible to ignore, and Officer Hayes felt it before he understood it. That slight shift in the air when control begins to slip not through resistance, but through something quieter, something harder to confront, and he straightened subtly, adjusting the weight of his stance as if reclaiming ground that had not visibly moved. While behind him, the line of officers remained in place, their silhouettes framed by the flashing lights, their radios still murmuring fragments of distant updates that no longer seemed entirely relevant to the moment unfolding right in front of them. And Hayes responded with a firmer tone, reiterating that this was not a discussion, that they had procedures to follow, that cooperation would make things easier, words that were meant to restore order but instead sounded rehearsed against the stillness of Angela's presence, because she did not push back, did not raise her voice, did not even shift her feet on the cold concrete. And that lack of reaction created a quiet pressure, like a mirror being held up without judgment, and one of the officers to the side glanced again at her, noticing the details that did not fit the narrative, the way her porch lights still glowed warmly behind her, the pair of neatly arranged shoes by the door she had not had time to put on, the faint outline of medical scrubs visible beneath her sweatshirt, hints of a life interrupted rather than a threat confronted. And those details began to accumulate, small but persistent, while Hayes continued speaking, outlining next steps, suggesting they would need to take her in for further questioning. Though his voice carried a trace of hesitation now, subtle but real, and Angela listened until he finished, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged, and then she tilted her head slightly, as if aligning something internal with what she was hearing. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a different weight. Not louder, not sharper, but deeper, grounded in something that extended beyond the boundaries of this street. "Before you decide what happens next," she said, "you should understand what you are stepping into." And the phrasing caught Hayes off guard, not because it sounded like a threat, but because it did not. It sounded like information, like a warning offered without hostility, and that distinction unsettled him more than defiance would have, because it suggested she was not reacting to them. She was aware of something they were not, and the officers nearby felt it too. That subtle imbalance where certainty begins to erode, where assumptions no longer sit as firmly as they did moments ago, and the flashing lights continued their steady rhythm, casting alternating shadows across faces that were no longer as confident as before. And in that quiet space between action and outcome, Angela's hands remained still, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if she had already stepped beyond the moment they were still trying to control. And somewhere deep in the line of vehicles an engine turned off, a small sound, almost unnoticeable, but in the silence that followed it marked the first sign that something in the night had shifted, even if no one had yet said it out loud. The stillness did not last because control, once questioned, always tries to reassert itself, and Officer Hayes took a step forward, closing the distance just enough to reclaim authority, his voice sharper now, less patient, telling Angela that whatever she believed was happening did not change the situation, that they had orders and those orders would be carried out. And the words landed heavier this time, not because they were louder, but because they carried the weight of a system that did not expect to be challenged, even quietly. And yet Angela did not move, did not retreat, did not let the pressure shape her posture. She simply looked at him, steady, present, as if she had already measured the outcome of this moment and found no need to rush toward it. And that composure created a subtle tension among the officers behind him, because they had seen resistance before, anger, fear, confusion. But this was different. This was someone who was not reacting to them at all. And that absence of reaction began to feel like something they could not control. And Hayes, sensing that shift, gestured slightly to one of the officers at his side, a quiet signal that moved the moment forward, that turned the pause into action, and the officer stepped closer, not aggressively, but with the clear intention of following procedure, of placing boundaries around Angela's freedom in a way that felt final. And the movement drew the attention of every eye on the street, neighbors leaning just a little further into their doorways, phones lifting higher, the quiet hum of recording devices capturing not just the scene but the imbalance within it. And Angela noticed all of it, the angles, the attention, the way the night had turned into something public, something irreversible. And for the first time her gaze shifted away from Hayes, just briefly, scanning the line of cars, the officers, the watching silhouettes beyond them, as if confirming something she already knew. And then she returned her focus to him, her expression unchanged, her voice calm when she spoke again. "You are making this bigger than it needs to be," she said, not as a warning, not as a complaint, but as a statement of fact. And Hayes responded immediately, almost reflexively, insisting that the scale of the response matched the seriousness of the report, that they did not deploy resources like this without cause. But even as he spoke, the certainty in his tone felt thinner, stretched by the absence of anything in front of him that justified it. And Angela listened, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging that he believed what he was saying. And that belief, more than anything, seemed to settle something inside her, because when she spoke again, her words carried a quiet finality. "Then you should hear it from someone you trust," she said. And before Hayes could respond, before the next instruction could be given, she added, "I need to make a call." And the request was simple, ordinary on the surface, but the way she said it shifted the moment once more, not upward, not louder, but deeper, like a line being drawn beneath everything that had already happened. And for a second Hayes hesitated, not because the request was unusual, but because something about it did not feel optional. And that hesitation, small as it was, did not go unnoticed by the officers behind him, by the neighbors watching, by the quiet street that had become something else entirely. And in that fragile space between decision and action, the balance of the night leaned ever so slightly away from control and towards something none of them had yet fully understood. The request did not echo loudly, but it landed with a weight that shifted every set of eyes in the street, because a call meant time, and time meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was the one thing Officer Hayes had been trying to eliminate since the moment the first patrol car turned onto the block. And he looked at Angela for a long second, measuring something he could not quite define, while the flashing lights continued their steady rhythm across her face, across his, across the watching windows and the quiet line of officers who were no longer standing as firmly as before. And somewhere behind him one of the radios crackled again, a distant voice asking for status, for confirmation, for control. But Hayes did not answer immediately, his focus still locked on the woman in front of him who had not raised her voice once, who had not stepped back, who had not given him the reaction he expected. And that absence had begun to feel like pressure, subtle but persistent, pressing against the certainty of the scene. And finally he spoke, his tone lower now, more controlled, asking who she intended to call, as if the answer might restore balance. And Angela did not hesitate, did not look away. She simply said a name, clear and steady, Marcus Reed. And the name moved through the air differently than anything else that had been said that night. Not louder, not dramatic, but precise, like something placed exactly where it needed to be. And Hayes blinked once, the reaction, small but unmistakable, because he recognized it, not from personal experience but from context, from briefings, from the kind of names that existed just outside the normal structure of his world. And he masked that recognition quickly, his expression tightening as he responded that she could make one call, that it would not change the situation, that they would still proceed as required. But the words felt thinner now, stretched across something he could no longer fully control, and Angela gave a small nod, reaching slowly toward the pocket of her sweatshirt, every movement deliberate, visible, respectful of the tension around her. And when she pulled out her phone, the glow of the screen lit her face softly, contrasting against the harsh rotation of the patrol lights. And for a brief moment, the entire scene narrowed to that single point of light in her hand, as if everything else had paused to watch what would happen next. And she dialed without hesitation, her fingers steady, her posture unchanged. And when the call connected, she did not raise her voice, did not explain the scene in panic or urgency. She simply said, "It is Angela." A pause, a breath. "I need you to come." And then she listened, her expression unreadable, her eyes steady, as if whatever was being said on the other end was already something she expected. And when she ended the call, she lowered the phone calmly, returning her hands to where they could be seen, and the silence that followed was different from before, heavier, deeper, as if something invisible had just entered the space between them, something that had not yet arrived physically but was already changing the shape of the moment. And Hayes felt it, even if he did not understand it fully, that subtle shift where control begins to loosen not through force but through presence. And behind him, one of the officers adjusted his stance again, glancing toward the line of cars as if expecting something, anything, to confirm that they were still in command of the situation. But nothing came, not yet. Only the steady pulse of red and blue lights and the quiet certainty of a woman who had just made a call that no longer felt small. The silence after the call did not feel empty. It felt occupied, as if something unseen had already stepped into the space and was waiting to be acknowledged. And Angela remained exactly where she was, her hands visible, her posture steady, her breathing slow and even, as though the cold air around her had no claim over her composure. And the red and blue lights continued to move across her face in quiet rhythm. But now they no longer defined the moment. They only surrounded it, because something else had begun to take shape beneath the surface, something that none of the officers could yet see, but all of them could feel. And Officer Hayes shifted his stance again, this time not out of authority, but out of discomfort, his gaze briefly breaking from Angela to scan the line of patrol cars, the officers, the street itself, as if searching for confirmation that everything was still under control. And yet nothing had changed outwardly. No new vehicles, no sudden noise, no interruption. Only the same quiet neighborhood, the same watching windows, the same steady woman standing in front of him. And that lack of visible change made the tension sharper, because it forced attention inward, toward uncertainty, toward the possibility that something had already been set in motion beyond his reach. And one of the younger officers cleared his throat softly, not speaking, just filling the silence for a second before letting it fall again. And the sound seemed louder than it should have been, like a small crack in a space that had grown too still. And Angela closed her eyes briefly, not in fear, not in retreat, but in thought, as if centering herself within the moment rather than reacting to it. And when she opened them again, there was no shift in her expression, only a quiet steadiness that felt anchored somewhere deeper than the situation unfolding around her. And the porch light behind her cast a soft glow along the edge of her shoulder, contrasting with the harsher flashes from the street, creating a line between two worlds, one calm, one chaotic, and she stood exactly between them, unmoved by either. And Hayes finally spoke again, his voice lower now, more controlled but carrying a trace of something new, something closer to caution than command, asking how long they were expected to wait. And Angela looked at him, her gaze clear, her tone unchanged when she answered, "Not long." And the simplicity of the response settled into the air with quiet certainty, not as a guess, not as hope, but as knowledge. And that certainty pressed against Hayes more than any argument could have, because it suggested she was not waiting for something uncertain, she was waiting for something inevitable. And behind him, another officer glanced toward the far end of the street, then back again, as if expecting movement that had not yet arrived. And the night seemed to stretch, every second slightly longer than the last, every sound slightly sharper, until even the distant hum of traffic beyond the block felt like it belonged to another world entirely. And in that suspended moment, With nothing visibly changing and everything subtly shifting, the balance of the scene tilted further away from control and towards something none of them had prepared for, something that had already begun the moment Angela made that call. The shift announced itself not with sirens or speed, but with absence, because at the far end of the street where there had once been the faint hum of distant traffic, there was suddenly nothing. No passing headlights, no movement beyond the line of houses, just a quiet that felt deliberate, and one of the officers noticed it first, his head turning slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to understand what had changed. And then another followed his gaze, and another, until the attention that had been fixed on Angela began to fracture, spreading outward towards something none of them could yet fully see. And Officer Hayes felt it too, that subtle pull away from the center of control, and he turned just enough to look down the street, his posture still firm but no longer rooted in certainty. And for a moment there was nothing, just the long stretch of asphalt under the glow of streetlights, empty and still. And then a set of headlights appeared, not fast, not urgent, but steady, controlled, moving with a purpose that did not match the chaos that had filled the street minutes earlier. And the vehicle behind those lights was not marked, not flashing, not announcing itself in any familiar way. And yet its presence carried weight, the kind that did not need explanation. And as it approached slowly, the officers instinctively adjusted, some stepping back half a pace, others straightening, their attention drawn away from Angela entirely now, because whatever was arriving did not belong to the pattern they had established, and Angela did not turn to look. Not immediately. She remained facing forward, her gaze calm, her posture unchanged, as if she had already accounted for this moment long before it arrived. And the vehicle came to a smooth stop at the edge of the scene, its engine idling quietly, its headlights cutting clean lines across the patrol cars and the figures standing between them. And for a second no one moved, not the officers, not the neighbors, not even Hayes, who now stood caught between the authority he had asserted and the uncertainty that had just entered his space. And then the driver's door opened, slow, deliberate, and a man stepped out, not in uniform, not in anything that immediately declared rank or role, but in the way he carried himself, in the way he looked at the scene before him without surprise, without hesitation. There was something unmistakable, something that did not ask for permission to be recognized. And his eyes found Angela first, not the officers, not the cars, not the flashing lights, just her. And he gave a small nod, simple, direct, and in that gesture there was acknowledgement, respect, and something deeper, something earned, and Angela returned it with the slightest incline of her head. No words, no urgency, just a quiet confirmation that what needed to happen next was already understood. And the man then shifted his attention to Hayes, and the air seemed to tighten around that moment, because this was no longer about a misunderstanding on a quiet street. This was something else entirely, something that had just stepped into view, and Hayes felt it before a single word was spoken, that whatever authority he thought he held had just been placed against something far greater, something he had not prepared for, something he could not easily dismiss. And for the first time since the night began, he did not speak first. The man did not raise his voice, and he did not rush forward, but the space around him seemed to shift as he stepped fully into the light, the quiet confidence in his movement carrying more weight than any command that had been spoken that night. And Officer Hayes felt it immediately, that subtle but undeniable change in balance, as if the ground beneath the situation had tilted without warning, and the man stopped a few feet away, his posture relaxed yet precise, his gaze steady as it moved from Hayes to the line of officers and back again, taking in everything without appearing to judge. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, and unmistakably certain. "I am looking for Angela Brooks," he said, and the simplicity of the statement landed harder than any demand could have, because it was not a question, it was an arrival. And Hayes straightened slightly, instinctively reclaiming his authority, asking who he was and what his involvement was in this situation. But even as he spoke, the words felt thinner, less anchored, as if they were being tested against something stronger. And the man met his gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged as he answered, "Commander Marcus Reed." And the name settled into the air with a clarity that did not need explanation, because even those who did not fully understand it felt the weight behind it, the kind of weight that came from experience, from responsibility, from decisions made far beyond the reach of a quiet residential street. And Hayes blinked once, his jaw tightening slightly as he processed it, his mind moving quickly through fragments of recognition, briefings, references that connected the name to something larger than this moment. And for the first time his voice shifted, not in volume but in tone, carrying a trace of caution that had not been there before as he responded, explaining that they were conducting an active investigation, that Angela was being detained for questioning, that procedures were being followed. But the explanation sounded incomplete even as he said it, because it no longer held the same authority it had moments ago, and Marcus listened without interrupting, his attention steady, his posture unchanged. And when Hayes finished there was a brief pause, a space where the tension tightened again, not with uncertainty this time, but with realization, and Marcus nodded once, acknowledging what had been said, before speaking again, his voice just as calm, just as measured, but carrying a quiet finality that cut through the layered noise of the scene. "Then your procedure is about to change," he said, not as a threat, not as a challenge, but as a fact, and the words moved through the line of officers like a shift in pressure, subtle but undeniable, and Hayes felt it, the moment where the structure he had relied on began to falter, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete, and Marcus took one small step closer, not aggressive, not forceful, just enough to stand fully within the center of the scene, and he turned slightly toward Angela, his expression softening for a fraction of a second, enough to reveal something deeper than authority, something rooted in respect, and then back to Hayes. And in that brief exchange the entire narrative of the night began to unravel, because this was no longer about suspicion or control, this was about recognition, about understanding who had been standing in front of them all along. And Hayes felt the weight of that realization settle in, slow but certain, as the flashing lights continued to pulse around a situation that no longer belonged to him. The words did not need to be repeated because their meaning had already settled into every corner of the street. And for a long second no one moved, not the officers, not the neighbors, not even the man who had just shifted the balance of the night with a single sentence. And Officer Hayes stood there feeling the weight of it press in, not from outside, but from within, as the certainty he had carried into this situation began to unravel piece by piece. And he looked at Angela again, really. Looked this time, past the surface, past the assumption, seeing the details he had overlooked before, the quiet steadiness in her posture, the absence of fear in her eyes, the calm that had never once broken, and those details rearranged everything, because they did not belong to the version of events he had believed in. And behind him one of the officers lowered his radio slightly, no longer speaking into it, as if waiting for a different kind of instruction, something that had not yet been given, and the flashing lights continued their rhythm. But they felt distant now, like background noise to a moment that had become something else entirely, and Marcus remained where he stood, not imposing, not demanding, simply present, and that presence carried more authority than anything else in the scene. And after a brief silence Hayes exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to show that something had shifted, something internal, something that could not be undone by protocol alone. And he nodded once, small but decisive, turning slightly toward the officer closest to Angela and giving a quiet instruction, not loud enough for the neighbors to hear, but clear enough to change everything. And the officer stepped forward, his movements slower now, more careful, as if aware that the situation he was handling was not what it had seemed. And Angela remained still as the constraint around her wrists was released, her hands lowering naturally to her sides without urgency, without reaction, as if this moment had always been inevitable. And no one spoke during that exchange, no apology, no explanation, just the quiet correction of something that had gone wrong. And Hayes looked back at Marcus, his expression no longer rigid but thoughtful, the weight of responsibility settling differently now, and he gave a slight nod, not formal, not rehearsed, just acknowledgement. And Marcus returned it with the same simplicity, no victory, no emphasis, just understanding. And then his attention shifted back to Angela, his voice softer when he spoke her name, and she stepped toward him, not hurried, not shaken, just steady. And as she reached the edge of the porch light, the contrast between the warm glow behind her and the fading red and blue lights around the street became more visible, as if one world was closing while another remained unchanged. And she paused for a brief moment at the threshold of her doorway, her hand resting lightly against the frame, and she looked back once, not at the officers, not at the cars, but at the space where everything had just happened, and there was no anger in her expression, no triumph, only a quiet clarity, as if the night had revealed something rather than taken anything away. And then she stepped inside, the door closing gently behind her, and the street, once filled with urgency and noise, fell into a silence that carried the unmistakable weight of something learned too late.